Hey there, thanks for joining today. I'm really excited to talk to you about my experience in building consumer grade products for the enterprise. A little bit about myself before we start. So my name is Ciara Peter. I head up product design at Gainsight, and I started my career as a designer and went into design management at Salesforce. I got the exciting opportunity to work on a lot of the innovations that the company was doing and exploring new markets at the time. And then I moved to a startup. So total contrast. I went from a 15,000 person company at the time to being one of the first 5 employees at a small startup, and was there for several years, kind of scaling through the first couple rounds of funding, Series A and B. After that, I moved to Box, where I headed up their consumer app. And the thing about consumer at Box is what you do for the end user experience. Box web app, Box Drive, Box mobile. The consumer and the enterprise experience is the same. So it's really important to be consistent there. And finally, what led me to Gainsight, continuing on the product route, but we really wanted to double down on design. And so I felt that it was my calling to go back there. So that's a little bit about me. And, as you can tell, I've worked in very small to very large companies. So hopefully I can provide insight that's useful to you. And I also want to mention that hopefully this talk is useful, even if you're not an enterprise company. I'm going to share some principles of best practices in design and product management and user psychology that should be applicable to all. So we're going to talk about what does consumer grade mean, and I'll share my definition. I'm going to walk through how to make your products more consumer grade, and also share some of the pitfalls. I said common, but maybe not so commonly known pitfalls to watch for as you're thinking through this. So, what does consumer grade mean? Well, one time I wanted to see, what's the definition of enterprise software? And I went to Wikipedia, and the definition is computer software used to satisfy the needs of an organization rather than the individual users. Well, that hurt my heart a little bit, because I don't know how you can possibly solve the needs of an organization without actually solving the problems of individual users. But it did really provide a lens on just how far enterprise software has come and how much it's changed since who knows when this entry was written. I want to share a little bit about the history of enterprise software and how the bridge is getting a lot smaller. So some of the early pioneers in enterprise were companies like Oracle and Autodesk, and they started with an on-premise model. This on-premise model could be that someone went into your physical company space and installed software maybe on your servers, or maybe they gave you some disks to install, but it really was kind of a one-time transaction. It was pushed to the company. And anytime the company released the vendor released new software, your old software may be out of date, but from a sales perspective and from a sort of customer satisfaction and customer success perspective, it was all about getting that sale. Now, I don't want to downgrade these companies, because the companies that I mentioned on this slide have now really successfully moved into the cloud. But they were early pioneers before cloud-based software even existed. And typically the person who made that decision was somebody in IT. IT typically did all of the software sourcing. Now, moving forward, companies like Salesforce actually was founded, I believe, in 1999, but the very late 90s, and went public in 2004, and really kind of started to become the standard in 2005. But they were very controversial because they were cloud first, and it was, people were like, well, how do you keep your data in the cloud? How do you keep it secure? How do you make sure that it doesn't crash? But they proved successful in this and sort of paved the way for this new cloud business. But the cloud business was different. This was an annual sale. So this is where the discipline of account management or customer success came up, where you had to go back and you had to make sure that the product was at least being used by the company, or the admin or the buyer, the stakeholder that you sold to in the first place, was able to find some value there. But the power was still really in the buyer and the admin's hands. Fast forward to today, and there are companies like Slack and Box that actually take this totally user-first approach. And even back around the 2010 timeframe, there was a company called Yammer that did sort of enterprise social, where people could just create accounts, and then eventually so many people at the company would create accounts that somebody in the organization would be compelled to buy because they wanted security, they wanted control over the data. And that is what's happening today in companies like Slack, Box, where it's user's choice. So first of all, a lot of companies are taking an approach where either they can sell to individuals or create free accounts. They can do a land and expand with a small group, and that group can share. So in Box's case, once they may sell to a small group, but if that group shares with other groups and those groups start to use their software, those groups will, at the renewal cycle, be charged for those licenses if they're still in use. So the power has shifted so much. And with the evolution of mobile in the last 10 years, there is no room for a bad experience. So I really would define consumer grade enterprise software as software that is used to satisfy the needs of an organization via its individual users. All right, what you're probably wondering is, that's great. Now, how do I make my products consumer grade? So the first point I want to make is designing for human psychology. This may seem obvious, but thinking about what users want, thinking about how the human mind works, this doesn't require a PhD. I am not an academic in any way in that way, but I do see how people feel and how I've felt in using software, and just taking those reactions is extremely important. So I'm going to start with one of the most basic frameworks of human psychology, which is the hierarchy of needs. Why is this important to us? Well, it's very important to know what need your product should be solving so that you are focused on the right things. For example, there could be a performance management software that has the goal of helping people to, work in a more efficient manner, set goals, realize their dreams. And it could easily, creating that software could easily think, well, this is for self-actualization and esteem. I'm going to evolve as a person. But when you think about what's at the core of HR and performance management, the reason you use that is for safety. Jobs, income, those all relate to the need of safety. So how do you make sure that it is very clear that you're solving for that safety first? Secondly, thinking about how things have changed with this new world, with COVID. There are probably some, and all of us working from home, there are probably some products, some apps, let's say social networking, that in previous times might have been sort of in the love and belonging category. You want to connect with others. You want to maybe build your reputation, which could be in the esteem category. But now that we're all at home, these things become critical for us to consume news, know what's going on in the world, etc. So I bring this up because I want you to think, what is the most important need I'm solving right now? And as any pyramid goes, you need to make sure that the needs before that are solved before you can successfully solve that need. One more point here is with social networking. There have been social networking apps and sites that maybe have had breaches of security or trust, and that would be in the safety category. And people stopped using or for some period of time because they didn't feel safe. So you can't really skip layers there. The second psychology related topic I want to bring up is the laws of UX. Now, the laws of UX, you can just search for this. It's a site. I believe it's also a full book, but I just love referring to the site because the interaction is kind of timeless and it contains all of these wonderful rules. So there are 20 principles that this laws of UX site talks about. And these are well studied, a lot of them by companies like Nielsen Norman Group, a really well-known usability related company, or web standard company, and several other large companies who have built software at scale. And I just want to point out a couple of my favorites. So the first is Jacob's Law, which is users spend most of their time on other sites. So we can be tempted in consumer software to design something new and innovative. I saw this trend, I saw this new interaction, or something really different and innovative. Now, I'm not saying do not innovate, but I am saying that the last thing that people want to do is learn how to use enterprise software. What they want to do with enterprise software is do their job so that they can move on with the more exciting aspects of their job or with their life. They don't want to spend their time learning. So I would recommend leveraging what's already out there and what's been proven in terms of interaction patterns if you're building enterprise software. So the second one, which is great, is aesthetic usability effect. So this says basically that if your site is more beautiful, people are going to perceive it to be more usable. Now, this is really interesting because as someone who has been a designer and a product person, I definitely, as the product person, have had the debate when the designer's like, we really need to fix the visual design. We have to make this pixel perfect. And I'm like, yeah, well, we have to get it out the door. But there is a study that proves, I don't remember the name of the actual company, but there was a site that was tested, and the user that it was tested with actually couldn't complete their workflow, but they gave the site a positive recommendation because it had beautiful graphics and it had photos. Now, photos are not appropriate for everything, and that's a whole other topic. But they found it so enjoyable that they didn't even care that they couldn't complete their transaction. It's not always the case. I'm just saying that there is a case for spending that extra time. And this also goes back to trust. If you see something that maybe something is a couple pixels off and the fonts don't match and there's not a lot of hierarchy, sure, the first thing you could think, well, is this isn't aesthetically appealing. But what people really think when they see that is, this is some small team is building this. They're understaffed. They don't have the resources to properly build the software, and they don't maybe have the knowledge or the experience to support my needs. This is especially important in the enterprise when you're selling contracts to an entire company, tens and hundreds or even of thousands or even millions of dollar contracts. Third law that I really like is called Hick's Law. And Hick's Law says that the time it takes to make a decision increases with the number and the complexity of choices. So I found this graphic. I love this. It's me, low IQ. But what this says is basically, if you are highly trained, it'll take you a little bit less time. But for the average user, really not a good idea to have more than 3, 4, 5 options on a page, because then you get stuck in analysis paralysis. And as a user, you don't really feel smart. You don't want your users leaving your product feeling confused or not smart or unaccomplished, because then they won't want to come back. They might have to complete a workflow, but you want them to want to. And how this is applied is drop-down menus. Sure, if you're a platform, you may have to enable many, many choices, but you want to make sure that if there's one primary action or a secondary action, a couple things that people need to do, really prioritize those rather than having 20 different buttons of the same color and size. Let's talk about research. So, research in the enterprise sort of has a reputation of being really overwhelming. Sometimes it's difficult to get access to your customers because you have to go through customer success, etc. And while it is important to respect the sort of expectations of your customers when it comes to reaching out to end users, there are a lot of ways to get the research that you need without having to create some long campaign or reaching out to 5 people to make sure that you get the approval. So I want to talk about a couple of these approaches. The first one is understanding user navigation. So in this example, we're looking at Gainsight PX analysis, but this really can be done with any sort of product analytics tool. And we have a feature that's called the cockpit. The cockpit is a list of tasks. And you'll look at the list of tasks and then you might want to see more detail. And what we were finding is there was some feedback from customers. They were saying, I'm lost. I'm not sure where I am at any given time when I'm using your app. And then we saw by looking at this navigation that people were going from the cockpit to the task, to the cockpit, to the task, to the user page, to the task. And what that did for us is, first, we connected the dots that, oh, this is an opportunity for us to make people not feel lost. But secondly, we actually implemented a brand new pattern where instead of making people go to a new page to learn more about their customer or that task at hand, we just open it in line. So this is a great way. And also what that does is it's not necessarily a bad thing to have people navigate around or view a bunch of pages, but the more you have to click around, the bigger your app feels and the harder it feels. It can be really intimidating and you feel like you're not making progress. So bringing the most actionable things forward can definitely impact the perception of your app to your users. Next, I want to talk about A/B testing. So there is a sort of a myth that A/B testing is not possible in the enterprise. There are many cases where A/B testing should not be done. For example, a core workflow, you've sold it, people have created their own training around it. It's not a great idea to just go and change that on your customers. You're going to be hearing from them and it can really negatively impact their workflow if you do that. But there are some things that are not in the core workflow that it is very easy to test. For example, testing the colors of buttons, actions. This is kind of what you do on a marketing site. Or another way I like to look at it is anything kind of before the login or in a non-logged in state is a great thing to test. So I want to talk about this example from Box. We had, so our entire goal is to get people logged in, whether they're a free user or not. If they are logging in, saving their files in Box, it's more likely they're going to find value and end up becoming a long-term customer. What we found was that anonymous views of files, and this is somebody who is a user sends a link to a file to someone else and they view that file. We had more anonymous views than actual logged in views. And that was very alarming to us because we weren't really able to provide the value that we wanted to our customers. So in this old world, 36% of people were just downloading the file and leaving. And then we had a sign up and a login button, and less than 2% of people were doing either of those things. So we said, what can we do to see if we can, get people more engaged? And we did an A/B test here. So the first option that we tested is a button that instead of a sign up and log in, we said save to Box, because that gave a little bit more incentive or provided a little bit more value. The second option is we said, okay, we're going to keep the download button, but as the file is downloading, we're going to pop you up a little screen that you can get rid of, but it says, did you know that you can create a free account, you can save your files, and it named a couple of benefits. And that was really successful because the second version of the test, performed about 32% better than the first version of the test, and almost twice as well as the existing design. Now, the one thing that I thought was, okay, 1%, 2%, who cares? Maybe it's 3% or 4%. But when you're dealing with millions or tens of millions of users, it makes a really, really big difference in terms of revenue. And another great thing about this type of A/B testing is I think that we launched this test in 2 weeks from start to finish, kind of coming up with the options. Maybe we kept it live for like a week or two, but I know that it was less than a month. So imagine you have a small team. I think we had 5 people on the growth team. Imagine you have a small team like that and you do 12 of these a year. You can start seeing some of those exponential results really add up. Usability testing. Okay, so yeah, I mean, when we were in school or learning about usability testing, we learned that, well, a usability test, you put together a group of tasks, you go sit in a room with you go find somebody, then you sit in a room with them for an hour, maybe use an eye tracker or something, which I think is very, very valid, but also very resource intensive unless you're at a large company that has dedicated user testing resources. What I've seen is really companies with fewer than 10 designers, it's very hard to make the case for usability testing or a dedicated team. So that doesn't mean that you can't do usability testing. Now, there are going to be some cases where you're working on a really specific workflow that the average consumer is not going to understand. So if you try to test it with strangers, they're just going to fail. But if there's some element of your product that is related to collaboration or things that people do kind of in their consumer lives and you need to test different versions, there are great apps that let you do this. This example I have here is Usability Hub. Now, okay, I do this preference test, which is 2 cats, and I feel really bad for the cat at the top because he didn't get any votes, but I asked 10 people, I said, which do you prefer? And I got the results here. I got these results in about 5 minutes. Now, preference doesn't always equal results. So this is a very simplistic test, but a better test that I like is measuring the accuracy of a task. So a lot of the times there will be some debate on what is the right call to action, what is the right placement of an item on a page, will people understand what this icon is? And I like putting up 2 side by side where either I test today and the proposal, or if it's some new design, testing 2 different options, asking the same question. You have to do task A, where would you click? That can give you most of the results that you need. And these apps will tell you where they clicked, what was the accuracy of the click, and how long it took them to make that decision. So a lot of the times you may have something where you're working with an executive, they feel really strong about something, and you don't have a lot of time with them. If you go back and get a usability test rather than kind of using your own opinion, or any stakeholder, not necessarily an executive, but if it's proven by data and you really do a side-by-side comparison, this is a great way to get past some of those debates. I also am a huge proponent of implementing systems. So Before any system can be implemented, it's important to define values. So this is something that we did with the Horizon experience at Gainsight recently. And we said, what are the things that must be true about everything we built? Well, simple. This goes back to some of those psychological principles, but fewer things on the screen. Don't give tons of options. Don't make people learn. Intuitive. We'll get to this in a moment, but it should be obvious what to do. But if it's not, add a line of copy. These are things that we just assume people are going to understand. But guess what? People don't want to read documentation. They don't want to go through training. Oh, well, there can be an argument. Well, this person, they use it all the time. They're going to know what it is. But if you have 50 lists, which you probably do if you're working on enterprise software, or you have several different lists that look the same, it is very important to remind people where they are and what they're supposed to be doing. They could be distracted by 100 different things. And finally, beautiful. Going back to one of the principles earlier, the aesthetic effect is that if something is more beautiful, it's going to be perceived as more usable. And it's not just about opinion, it's about that people will have more patience and they'll stick around until they complete the tasks that you need or that they need and they find value. So design system is very important. Now, a design system can seem daunting if you're at a smaller scale, but I recommend look at other design systems that are out there. A lot of them are open source. Maybe you can take some of the elements of another design system and tweak them for your brand. Don't just straight up rip them off, obviously. Make sure you look at their copyrights, but there are many ways to do this. Or just pick 3 out. Maybe you pick a color palette, fonts, and something else. And you say, this is going to be our design system for now. It makes such a big difference. Going back to that element of trust and feeling like one person worked on everything, not some scattered bunch of teams or not some understaffed organization. Voice and tone. This gets overlooked all the time. But as a user, you don't want to feel like you made a mistake. And if we look at this form on the left, the red X shows the form you filled contains errors. I'm telling you that you did something wrong. Well, maybe they did, but it's probably my responsibility as the creator of this software to help them not get it wrong. Nevertheless, we need them to move on. So this example on the right, please enter a valid zip code for your region. It's much easier and it doesn't make people feel like they made a mistake. On that same note, looking at the right, operation could not be completed. These error messages, it's really important to make them more human. And one thing that I did recently is I looked at what are all the different types of microcopy that you can have in the app. And I worked with our documentation team and we made templates that we could give to the product managers and the engineers that was like if anyone knows what a Mad Lib is, it's a fill in the blanks type of format where it's going to work for 90% of the cases. We looked at what are the top 30 use cases? What do we think is like a good sentence structure for that? And saves people a bunch of time. So let me just close out with a couple of common pitfalls to watch for as you are thinking through these. The first is unrealistic usage targets. So as we started seeing consumer products like Facebook with millions and millions of users, daily users, daily active usage became a hot metric. And that metric is very appropriate for things like Instagram, things like social media, things like games that depend on you coming in every day. But think about these brands. Well, the first thing I see when I look at this list is, okay, these are pretty cool companies. I like their apps. I like using them. But think about what they do. They all do things that we do not want to do every day. If you're an executive assistant, maybe, or an accountant, maybe you're an Expensify all the time. I certainly don't want to be filing expense reports every day though. And the reason that it's important to know what your goal is beforehand is if you're trying to get people to use something daily that is not intended for that, you're going to build the wrong things. You're going to be pinging people with notifications all the time to file insurance claims or whatever it is, when that's not what they should be doing. the goal of these types of apps that solve very specific problems is to get people in and out as quickly as possible. I love these. People at these companies are very smart, whoever was in charge of this. At Expensify, you weren't born to do expensive. These guys are like extreme jump ropers. They don't want to be doing expenses, but let's make sure that if they are, it's easy, maybe even fun. Maybe they get a reward for it. The City mobile app, designed for you to spend less time in it. It's very counterintuitive to all these points, but it is so true. Second pitfall to watch for is shipping all the time. So this is, and I love Facebook. I think I've used an example a couple times now, so not a dig on them at all. But I think this phrase became really popular in 2012, 2011, around that time. Move fast and break things. Meant like ship things all the time. Do experiments. Do large scale testing. This can work in some scenarios, but in many scenarios, this is actually what happens. Where they say, some company announces their new design, it's so great, we have this new brand, and the person is like, what is going on? People don't necessarily like change. And when you see these reactions, it's not so much, it's usually not that they don't like your design, it's that they don't want to have to relearn. They don't want to not be a master of something they've already spent time with. And this is why release communications are very, very important. It's also this called landing the plane. You work on something for 5 months and then you finally get it out to the market and you don't have a message for people. They're like, well, this thing moved. I don't know where it went. What am I supposed to be doing here? All of these things are important. Tell the end user an app, have guides, email them. They may not read all of them, but at least you've covered your bases, and the dependability is very important. And the final pitfall is AdminUX is an afterthought. I love this. Admins are people too. So I've heard a lot of time, oh, let's just shove it in the admin, or it's going to be, the admin can take care of it. Well, guess what? The admin might be 1 or 10 users out of the whole group, but they are arguably the most important. They're the one that's either, they may not be the executive stakeholder, but they're talking to that stakeholder, and they're either making a case for your renewal or not. So this is a great example by Box, where we discovered, well, we were looking at our mobile experience, and what we discovered is that we really thought it was important to look at it from look at the end-to-end experience from both an end user and an admin point of view. We started with admin, and the first thing we found, we said, well, okay, how does an admin, do they need to enable mobile apps? And we went there, and there's this button called Disable Apps by Default. And if you click this, it disables all partner apps. So it's implied that this will disable the partner apps, but not Box's native apps. And so we had this thing where a lot of customers had turned off the native apps by default. And what we did is we then created a separate section for the native apps, and we put that here above the application settings so that it was very clear that you weren't turning off mobile, you weren't turning off Box Drive, because those apps were actually buried on like page 14. So these little things, these little exercises that sound, very kind of conceptual, and I don't know if I have time for those things, this can really uncover a lot for you. So to summarize, being consumer grade, and really the requirement or the recommendation for anyone building enterprise software these days is you need to satisfy the needs of your individual users before you can get to the organization. And when you're making the products, think about human psychology, think about you. You as a human are a very good example of how people might feel and what they want to experience. It's easy to do quick research and implement some of those systems, and finally watch out for the pitfalls and make sure that you're setting the right targets and making sure that your users and your admins are in the loop at all times. Hope you enjoyed the presentation, and thank you so much for watching.